Okay, we did not want that. Hi, good morning, everyone. We are going, I don't know how that one happened. That was interesting. Let's take that out of there. Good morning. Welcome to She Became Visible. I knew that something like this would happen if I did a live stream rather than a record, but that's all right. We'll fix it. We'll fix it afterwards. Welcome to She Became Visible. I have a fabulous guest on today. Let me introduce you to Lundy Bancroft. He is an author of at least 5 different books, and I'm going to highlight those. He is a workshop leader and a consultant on domestic abuse and child maltreatment. And his area of focus is, let me bring it up here, training professionals on best practices for intervening with male perpetrators of violence against women toward the goal of promoting accountability and reoccurring charges, training professionals on the dynamics of emotional injury and recovery in children who are exposed to a man who abuses their mother, to prepare participants to offer the most effective and safe assistance possible to children and their mothers. Is that not amazing? Supporting healing and empowerment for abused women with emphasis on advocating for the human rights of mothers and their children. Now, how often do you hear that? So he is the author of at least 5 books. Why does he do that? The Batterer as Parent, The Joyous Recovery, Should I Stay or Should I Go? When Dad Hurts Mom, and Daily Wisdom for Why Does He Do That? Those are just some of the highlights. And his most popular book is Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. And this bestseller is a groundbreaker. Lundy is a counselor who specializes in working with abusive men. He uses his knowledge about how abusers think to help women recognize when they are being controlled or devalued, and to find ways to get free of an abusive relationship. And I love this. I absolutely love this. So I'm going to quit talking and I'm going to bring him, Lundy, on right now. And let me get out of this great, big, huge screen here so I can bring Lundy on. So good morning.
Good morning to you and to your audience, Renee.
Thank you so much. And I especially, I don't know, again, I don't know how this crazy algorithm works, how you popped into all of my YouTube feeds. But when I found you, I became absolutely obsessed and watched every YouTube that I could find where you were a guest. And then I also followed your training that you were doing in Kentucky. And that was just hours and hours. But the information was just mind-boggling for me because of your concentration on women and the justice system. And also the other mind-blowing thing for me was your emphasis on not trying to mentally diagnose abuse as a mental condition and bring it out into maybe just an elitism. And so we are just going to get right off and we're going to start talking immediately. Let's start out with your description of the mental illness, or the description of abusers must be narcissists. So let's start out by talking about that and how you learn that from your years and years of counseling men.
It's very tempting to want to believe that there's got to be something wrong with this guy's heart, that he's got to have some kind of psychological problem.
Right.
Partly because he tends to be so lacking in compassion, like he just doesn't seem to care about the kind of harm that he's causing the woman he's involved with, or a whole history of women behind her that he's perhaps harmed as well. And unfortunately, it's a misdirection. Like the focus on, well, there must be something wrong with him psychologically, or I've got to figure out why he's so unhappy, or what's wrong with his heart, just becomes part of the trap for the woman. That's part of what really keeps her sucked in, thinking, well, if I can just figure out what's bothering him, or I can just figure out what happened in his childhood, or I can just help him feel better, then he'll treat me better, and this explosive stuff will stop happening. And the reason I say it's a dead end is because it never works. She can spend years of her life trying to build his self-esteem or reassure him that she's not cheating on him, or tell him, hey, I'm not against you. I'm not, why do you look so negatively upon me? I'm not against you. I'm not out to get you. And it never goes anywhere. And the reason it never goes anywhere is because that's not where the problem lies. The problem lies almost entirely in his mind, in his belief system, his values and his attitudes. And he's been socialized, unfortunately. He's learned from very early in life that he has a right, when he's in a relationship with a woman, to treat her more or less like a servant, like someone who was put on this earth to do for him. And I don't necessarily mean servant in the kind of household, like you have to do all the laundry and all the house cleaning and all the cooking, although it's pretty common that he expects that kind of servant also. But it's service in all kinds of other ways, like to take care of him emotionally, to constantly be available to him no matter what, to take care of him sexually. Like her whole life is supposed to be devoted to doing for him. She's not supposed to have a life with her own needs or her own desires or her own friendships. Her life is really supposed to disappear into his. That's his mentality. That's what he's looking for. And you were talking about elitism, and the term that we use a lot in the field is entitlement, that the abuser just feels entitled to have all these things done for him and to have her personality or her being really disappear into his. There was this old joke that really fits very well into the world of abuse, which is people used to say, when two people get married, they become one, and that one is the man. And that's how an abuser looks at things. That's how he thinks it ought to be. In fact, he really believes that it's unfair of her to continue to insist that she should have rights to her own needs or her own friendships or some peace and quiet in her life or some sharing of the labor. But when you look at this behavior, particularly when you live with it in your house, it looks crazy. And I think that's one of the reasons why people get so sucked up into this belief that he must be diagnosable, right? There must be something wrong with him psychologically. And now commonly on the web, these guys are all referred to as narcissists, even though most of them are not actually in any clinical sense narcissists. So one way that I describe this to people that sometimes helps people get it is that if you're engaging in a really destructive behavior that your society condemns, then you've almost certainly got serious psychological problems. In a way, you have to have serious mental health problems to chronically behave in a really bad way that your society condemns. But what if you're chronically behaving in a really destructive way that your society accepts or even encourages? In that case, you don't have to have anything psychologically wrong with you to behave in those ways. And the model I tend to give people, the analogy is, think about a country, and I won't name names, but think about a country where the abuse of alcohol is really a way of life in that country. And there are a number of these places in the world where what you might consider alcohol abuse in that country is just how people expect to live. It's considered completely normal. And I'm not saying it's healthy. I think it's quite destructive, but that's not how it's viewed. It's viewed as this is life. And to look at someone in that nation who's abusing alcohol and try to figure out what's wrong with this person, like, hey, something must be wrong with this person psychologically, you'd be really missing the boat, because it's like, no, this person is struggling with is that they've grown up in a society where everybody's drinking too much and everybody's blaming their bad behavior on alcohol, and it's just considered perfectly normal. In other words, it's a cultural problem. And this is what we have with male violence against women in the modern world, is that it's a cultural problem. And I don't mean that it belongs to a certain culture, but so you might better call it a societal problem. But I call it a cultural problem because I mean it's what this male grew up believing was completely acceptable and normal behavior. And so unfortunately, he doesn't have to have anything psychologically wrong with him. And I'll just say a couple more things. There was an interesting study done a long time ago by researcher that I've known well over the years, Jay Silverman, where he looked at boys who'd been exposed to domestic violence. In other words, they'd had a dad or stepdad who abused their mother when they were growing up. Looking at which of those boys grew up to become abusers themselves and which of those boys did not become abusers themselves as adults. And he compared boys who were more traumatized by the violence they'd witnessed to boys that were less traumatized by the violence they witnessed, and found that that wasn't the dividing line. He found that those two groups had roughly the same rates of offending as adults. In other words, the trauma was causing all kinds of other problems, mind you, but the trauma was not what was causing them to become offenders themselves when they reached adulthood. Then he did a number of different comparisons, dividing up this group and this sample in a number of different ways. But then he divided them between boys who had really bought in to the abuser's excuses and his essential worldview, and the ones who had not. And boom, that's where he found a huge difference in the rate of offending. In other words, it's not boys' trauma that's leading them to become abusers of women. The trauma is causing them to have depression and suicidality and attention problems and zillions of other problems, but it's not what's causing their offending against females. What's causing their offending against females is what they learned from being around the abuser that justifies this behavior. In other words, what it really means is they learned to blame their mother for what the abuser was doing to her. And this is why I've been so focused over the years on how desperately urgent it is for us to teach boys and girls who are growing up with an abuser in the home, your mother is not responsible for what this man is doing to her. She's responsible for her actions and you're responsible for your actions, but none of you are responsible for his actions. He is 100% responsible for his own actions. And this is the key message that we need to be getting to kids who have a man in the home abusing their mother, if we want those kids to have a chance of healing, and if we want those kids to stay out of becoming abusers and victims of abuse as adults.
That's amazing. Well, tell everyone, because I'm sure that this isn't something that you knew right away when you came out of your schooling as a counselor and you went and you chose your path. I'm sure this wasn't this is something that you've learned over your experiences with working with these men as counselors. So let's go back a little bit and tell it, because I have so many questions. Let's go back and tell everyone kind of what your trajectory was, how you got into this field, and what you began to observe as you were counseling these men who had been accused of domestic violence and had been either, most of them, if I remember correctly, and correct me, were mandated to go into some kind of therapy. But there were some that were choosing this for some reason or another. You can talk about that, but tell everybody about how this knowledge came about for you.
So one thing I do have to say is that the people who trained me told me what I'm saying to you now, and I didn't believe them. I didn't believe them. So I was in my mid-20s, and when I started into working with abusers, and they told me, like, these guys know what they're doing. They're not losing control of themselves. They've got really entitled attitudes, patriarchal attitudes. I didn't believe it. I thought, oh, well, this is just this program's dogma. Like, this is their line, and how could these guys not be losing control of themselves? How could they not be troubled, suffering individuals? So I was reluctant to let go of that. And over my first 1 to 2 years, I'd say it took me 2 years to fully let go. And I made some real mistakes that I don't feel good about during that period. And what I had to be faced with really was the difference between my clients' accounts of what had happened and what we were hearing from the abused women. Now, one of the key ways that an abuser program is different from, say, therapy, and an abuser program that's being properly run looks nothing like therapy, is that a properly run abuser program is interviewing confidentially the victim and finding out what actually happened. Because the domestic abuse perpetrator is completely unreliable in his account of what took place.
I
And
remember
so,
hearing you say that, and that was another light bulb thing where you always kept in contact with the abused.
so my education really came from the contrast between how
Mm,
he would present what had happened and how she would present what had happened, and what the realities were of what had happened. And but sometimes I could even find it just in his own story.
mm,
So but I'll start with things that I learned from listening to the women. So one of the things I heard over and over again from listening to the women is he goes berserk, so to speak. It seemed berserk, and just smashes stuff up all over the house. Well, I was trained, fortunately, by my early mentors to ask what gets broken and does anything ever get broken that matters to him?
oh,
And lo and behold, I discovered that nothing that's important to him ever gets broken. Minor things that belong to him might get broken, but nothing that's important to him ever gets damaged. Whereas things that matter so much to her are getting damaged and often smashed to smithereens. In fact, he's targeting things that he knows are going to be emotionally important to her, where it's going to be painful to her to have these things being broken. Well, how out of control is that? If how
mm,
berserk is that when he's choosing what he smashes and what he doesn't? There's method to the madness. And then I started to notice how when police appeared at the house, he could pull himself together as quick as you could snap your fingers. And she couldn't. She was traumatized. And so I started to notice how common it was for police to come into a domestic call and decide that the woman was the problem.
yes.
Because he'd be like calling them sir and madam to the officers, and he'd be sort of looking at her saying, gee, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle this woman. And she'd be like yelling and swearing, and police would think, oh, she seems to be the aggressive one here. Well, again, how out of control is that if he can turn it off like flicking a switch when the police are at the door and speak politely to them and come up with these, lies about what happened and so forth. And I had an early client who told me that he'd been extremely drunk and had beaten his wife up very badly. Unusual for him to admit that from the beginning, but he did. And his wife, when I interviewed her, confirmed that he had in fact been very drunk, that he wasn't lying about that. But what stood out about that guy, he was one of my first clients, was that I was asking him to describe her injuries. And he started to describe all these welts and black and blues that she had up and down her legs from his very, very nasty assault of her. And I said, well, what kind of injuries did she have, like to her arms or to her face? And he looked at me like he thought I was kind of stupid and said, well, I wasn't going to do anything that would show. And he knew it. Now, here's a guy who's very drunk while he's committing this assault, who's still not losing track of his own interests. So, and I could tell, I could endlessly go on with these stories, but I think these are enough examples of what little by little I was forced to face up to, which is these guys very, very rarely do more harm than they intended to do. They very rarely do harm that's going to get them in trouble. Sometimes they make mistakes and they do get in trouble, but not very much. And any abused woman can tell you how rare it is to this day for an abuser to experience any serious consequences for his actions, and how much calculation there is. And actually, I'll give you one more example because it's a completely different sort of example. Woman after woman after woman told me that the abuser would measure, he would take the car and measure on the odometer the distance from the house to the supermarket. And then anytime when she said she'd been out during the day to go to the supermarket, he would go and check the odometer and make sure that she'd only gone exactly the distance between home and the supermarket and back. Well, how out of control is that? This is incredibly calculated. That he's actually taken steps to make sure that he can monitor her every move. So that was such a huge part of my education, to have to be face to face with how deliberate and thought out an abuser's behavior is overall. I don't mean that he's like a mad scientist who's planned every single detail, but
Right.
overall he knows what he's up to.
That's amazing. And I know that you've referred to the idea, and that a lot of in the justice system, a lot of the punishment will come down to, oh, he needs anger management. And I know you addressed that. Where talk a little bit about how this idea that he has just an out of control, again, a mental issue that could be cured or medicated, but he has an anger issue, or like you were saying, the narcissism. But and then also talk about the comparing of the how they're at work, where people will say, well, he's the nicest guy. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better boss. I can't imagine. So I mean, these are all things that come to play when these men are accused of domestic violence. And then the neighbors were like, he's the nicest guy. He helped me out. He shoveled my driveway. I just can't understand how she could accuse him of such a thing. So talk
And
about, yeah.
they're often exactly extra people pleasers of the kind that you're describing, because I think the one of the fundamental ways to think about him that is really helpful is that he has a power orientation towards partner relationships. His orientation towards being with in any kind of halfway serious relationship with a wife or a girlfriend is about how he can increase his power. Now, he doesn't consciously think of it in that way, but that's that on a deeper level. That's what's driving him. That's what's motivating everything he does. And pleasing the neighbors is one of the ways you increase your power, because it makes, for exactly the reason you're describing, because it makes you look so good. It makes people deny that the abuse could be happening. And so it's strategically very, very effective. And one of the things that an audience member at one of my trainings said about 3 years ago, which I wish someone had said to me 30 years ago, because it was so incredibly sharply on point, is she said, abusers are masters of managing their anger. Why would you send them to anger management to help them learn how to do that even more? They know how to turn it on and off based on when it's useful to them. They are often very angry during their most scary assaults, and that's one of the reasons why the system mistakenly focuses on their anger. But so much of their behavior they're not doing while they're angry. But it's also another key point that gets missed here, which is that what you do when you're angry tends to be what most reveals what your values are.
Mm.
And so rather than thinking that somehow that's an aberration, that's actually a key insight into a person. And people who are not violent or not oppressive, no matter how enraged they are, do not become violent or oppressive. So even if he were angry during these things, always very angry during these things, that wouldn't tell us much about why he was doing them. And the fact is, as I've just given you all these illustrations of, so many times he's not particularly angry while he's doing them. Anger management was designed for people who are very, very unstable and who truly can't govern what they do when they're angry. Well, that doesn't apply to men who abuse women. The men who abuse women, because if you genuinely have no control over what you do when you're angry, you don't have a partner. No one's going to stay involved with a guy who's just randomly angry. The way he sucks someone in is precisely by managing his anger so well and being able to be positive for periods of time, particularly the first couple of years in a relationship. You wouldn't be with someone unless they could be positive for extensive periods of time early in a relationship. And so when we say don't send an abuser to anger management, that's not a criticism of anger management. It's just saying that's not a service that was ever designed for men who abuse women. That's not what it's for.
Interesting.
it's like sending someone with chronic foot problems to the eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist. It's like, what? Wait, it's the wrong doc, you know.
That's
And
amazing.
the if all he's learning really is more strategies to manipulate his anger to his advantage, which is how he already does things.
That's amazing. I never thought about that, that when they go to these anger management classes, they're like, oh, check, check. Remind me to use those I words or the other
Right.
verbal therapy words that are thrown around nowadays. You know, everyone is like, you know, you can't say but I can say and so, you know, so that somehow makes your criticism, you know, more acceptable because you're using the correct therapy words.
And the modern abuser is sometimes quite therapized,
Yeah.
and he becomes, again, he just even more deceptive, even more likely to fly under the radar, because you'll hear people in the legal system, for example, or in the therapeutic system saying, oh, he's very, very insightful, as if therefore he wouldn't be an abuser because he has so much insight.
Yeah.
And well, boy, an insightful abuser is in many ways the most destructive one of all.
Oh my gosh. And talk about how when you have people that are mandated to go into your one of your programs and how frustrated they get because they'll say, look, I've made the changes. I let her do this or I let her do that. And she's still not, you know, stepping up or she's not grateful for all the things that I'm letting her do now. And how long it takes for these, and a lot of times it never does, and the therapy never does really work because of what you said, the cultural training of the entitlement that they have. And so talk a little bit about that frustration where they're like, I was being such a great guy and she's not giving me the respect that I demand.
So the one way to think about what's driving his behavior, and there are a number of different filters to put it through, but one of the ways to think about it is he really has an orientation towards relationships towards intimate relationships that's about what this relationship is doing for me. In the
Mm.
early part of the relationship, he may talk the big talk about what we're going to do for each other, but once you've been involved with him for a while, you start to realize, no, it's all about him. It's all got to be about the meeting of his needs. And his perceptions get so distorted because of how entitled he is that he starts to believe that he's only defending his own rights. He's got things exactly backwards in his mind
Mm.
because he believes that he has the right to be constantly catered to and not have to do his share of anything and have her give up her life and the things that I was talking about earlier. So he feels very justified in using abuse. He doesn't consider himself abusive. He just feels like these are necessary behaviors in order to enforce this incredibly unequal relationship that he feels he's entitled to. Again, he wouldn't describe it as incredibly unequal. So his feeling is that he shouldn't have to use these behaviors to get all this catering, that the catering should come to him automatically. And so he's having to use these behaviors to enforce that catering because of how unreasonable and unfair and selfish and so forth she is. This is how distorted his perception becomes of what's going on in that relationship. So his feeling is that if he gives up being abusive, it's her responsibility to meet his needs on his terms just as much as she was when he was abusing her. In other words, her life should still just be completely devoted to doing for him. And the reality is that if you abuse a woman less, your life is going to become somewhat more difficult. Why? Because you're going to start to be involved with a human being instead of with someone who's totally afraid of you. And a human being is going to start to assert her own needs and is going to start to stand up for you sometimes. And sometimes is going to do things you don't like. And sometimes is going to want to go and have her friendships, even though it makes you jealous, because she has a right to have friendships. And so his feeling is, I'm giving up some of my abusive behaviors, and it's not making my life any better. It's making my life harder. So, why would I want to do this if it's just making things more difficult for me? And precisely the signs that he is treating her a little better are to him bad signs
Yeah.
because she's becoming in certain ways more difficult. And this is why this is one of the main reasons why we see lots of short-term improvement in abusers and very little lasting improvement in abusers. Because once they start to face the fact that they're not going to get rewarded for this, they need to be doing this because it's the right thing to do, not because they're going to get rewarded for it.
Oh my God.
Then they're like, forget it. I'm going back to my old behaviors. And now I believe, because of my values, that eventually his own life would improve from not treating women this way. But he's not going to see those rewards for 2 or 3 or 4 years down the line. In the short term, as I say, it's going to make his life more challenging. And the abuser isn't the kind of person who's going to look 3 or 4 years down. It's like he wants instant gratification right now. He wants her, as you say, to be grateful. And I used to use this analogy with guys in my group, with the abusers in my group. I'd say, okay, say you came to your first meeting of the abuser group, and I called you a F and this and F and that, grabbed you by the lapels and threw you down in your chair right when you came in the door. And you said, this program is a crock. I'm never coming here again. I'm saying, oh God, I'm sorry. I'm volatile. I really got to do better. I won't do it again. Please don't quit the program. Then you came back the second week and I did exactly the same thing again, grabbed you by the lapel, called you these names, shoved you down in your chair. And you said, that's it. That's it. And I said, oh God, I'm really sorry. I promise you, really, this time I absolutely promise you. I promise you, I won't do it again. I shouldn't have done that. I'm really sorry. Please, one more try. So you show up to my group the third week, and I call you, a bunch of names, F and A and this stuff, and I block your way so that you have to sit in a chair, but I don't actually shove you. And you're like, forget it. No third chances. I'm done with this program. And I'm saying, wait, I'm doing better. I'm doing better. I didn't shove you this time. Like I didn't even touch you this time. And like I'm improving. You're going to quit right when I'm improving? Like I'm doing better. And of course, everybody in the group will say, that's ridiculous. Of course I wouldn't stay in this program. That's totally unprofessional. It's totally unreasonable. And then I say, but that's exactly what you're asking of your partners. You're saying that because you haven't even stopped abusing her, you're saying that because you're somewhat less abusive than you used to be, she owes you a bunch more time trying in this relationship, because that's always how the abuser says, is she owes me more. She shouldn't give up. She shouldn't leave me. And that she should be grateful to you. You're not feeling grateful to me that this time I finally didn't shove you down in your chair.
Yeah.
And as soon as it's about them, then their rules obviously are very, very different.
Well, talk about how there were degrees of abuse that even in your group, there's a group of men sitting there. I visualize everyone in the typical therapy circle, and there would be a man that would tell the story, and there would be other abusive men that would go, "Whoa, dude, that was out of hand. I mean, you can't choke." Or the other one would say, "Oh, but what I did is not bad, but man, dude, you can't do that." And so there was this degree of abuse that was like authorized or something like that. You kind of touched on that a little bit.
So, and this also connects back to my initial point about the fact that abusers don't actually lose control of themselves.
Yeah.
Unless they have very, very serious mental health problems, which the vast majority of abusers do not.
Right.
So because they're not really losing control, what it means is that they're drawing a line, it's in their mind, of what they consider acceptable behavior and what is not. And they don't cross the lines of what they themselves consider justified based on, in his mind, whatever she did wrong. And so one of the techniques that I used in groups is when a guy told me what he admitted to, say, oh, I slapped her twice and then I shoved her down. And I'll say to him, okay, there she was on the ground because you had shoved her down. Why didn't you kick her in the head? And he'll always tell you why. He won't say, oh, I don't know, I just didn't, or I got control of myself or whatever. He'll tell you, oh God, I could kill her if I did that. Or ooh, I realized one of my children had come into the room and I didn't want them to see that. Or, so he'll give you a reason. And the most common reason that he'll give, well, it's not really a reason, it's a reaction. His most common reaction is, ooh, I wouldn't do that. Well, that's incredibly revealing when you think about it, because it means that he's not going to do anything that he himself considers unacceptable.
Oh,
And that's far and away the most common response is, ooh, I wouldn't do that.
yeah.
And that's one of the things that tips us off that he's not really out of control, that he's got a messed up value system. Because to his value system, because of whatever her transgressions were in his mind, slapping her twice and shoving her down was justified, but kicking her in the head would not. So then they have sometimes quite strong and critical reactions. This is what you were referring to other guys in the group who they either feel used a level of violence that they would not believe was acceptable, or feel that what he did, he didn't have good enough provocation for. So that means how he used his own violence is, I kept it to the right level and I did it for good enough reasons. And I've had a few clients over the years, I forget if I said this in the book or not, but I've had a few clients over the years who said to me, like, I'm not one of those guys who comes home and beats his wife for no reason. And so whatever he is, in his mind, the real abusers are the next steps up the line.
Yes.
So like, if he only shoves his partner, then the real abusers are the ones that slap her or punch her. And if he punches her, but he's never hospitalized her, then the real abusers are the ones that put her in the hospital, and so forth up the line until the ones who say, well, what, I didn't kill her. And so, and the ones who in their minds don't have good enough reason, good enough excuse for what they're doing.
Yeah. Talk about, and this is the thing that was so startling for me, because there's so much going on in the world right now. And, when you talk about the entitlement, and I see that there's a movement right now, a patriarchal movement for this entitlement to be authorized once again. And it's almost like a backlash, because you talk a lot about the men's movement that went on. I want to say it was probably, was it like in the 80s where the men were like, hey, wait a minute, we have rights too. And so the justice system kind of switched over to, you know what, we need to, it used to be the mother automatically got custody of the children. And now the fathers were like, hey, I have some rights too. And so the pendulum kind of swung in this men's rights movement. And talk about what that's done to the justice system.
It's a huge sort of nightmarish problem in the child custody system in particular, which is what you just made
right.
a reference to about what happened with child custody.
Right.
And even in the days of the maternal, what was known as the maternal preference or the tender years doctrine, when mothers had advantage for custody, first of all, that generally only applied to quite young children. That was why it was called the tender years doctrine. And it only applied to a woman who had, almost perfect, clean look about her. Like, she couldn't be someone who had some alcohol problems, or she couldn't be someone who, there was something bad in her history, or it was like even that only applied to kind of like the woman who looked almost perfect in court. But what I think people often are forgetting, even when they're talking about those years of maternal preference, is that those were years when moms were doing close to 100% of the raising of children. So when moms were winning custody all those years, that's not a sign of court bias. I don't believe the courts were ever biased in the favor of mothers. Those are appropriate custody decisions. When mothers are doing almost all the raising of children, then they should be winning almost all the custodies. In our time, fathers have started to contribute more of the child care than they used to. They're still nowhere close to doing 50-50 child care, nowhere near it. Study I saw that was only about 10 years ago still found that there were 50 full-time stay-at-home moms for every full-time stay-at-home dad.
Yeah.
And of course, that's only looking at full-time stay-at-home parents. Most families now can't afford any full-time stay-at-home parent. But who's doing the full-time stay-at-home parenting tells us a lot about who's raising children in general. So if you look at a court and that court is giving custody 50% of the time to dads and 50% of the time to moms, that's not evidence of an even-handed court. That's evidence of a court with a huge pro-father bias. Because we know that still in I don't know, something like 80 to 90% of those cases, maybe more, the mother was the primary caretaker. It was the children's primary emotional bond. It was who they were spending by far the most time with. And it's not good for kids post-divorce to suddenly be half time with each parent when before they were spending 90% of the time with their moms. That's very unhealthy for kids. And it's really looking at kids as like a loaf of bread to be divided between the parents rather than focusing on what's good for kids. And the courts say, oh, well, we're looking at the best interests of the child, but they're not. They're looking at the best interests of the dad, because it's not in the best interest of children to be divided 50-50 unless that's how they were spending their time before the divorce.
Right.
Was truly 50-50 parent. Now we're starting to have states all across the nation mandating joint custody. That's about, father supremacy. I'm reluctant to call it father's rights, because that's not father's rights. That's fathers awarding themselves all kinds of things that are not their rights and demanding all kinds of things that they have no right to. And so it's really, like I've always insisted, this is not a father's rights movement. This is a father supremacy movement. And let's call things what they are. And the so much of the pain for children in a divorce is how everything is changed and disrupted. It's so hard for kids. And so a court that was thinking well about kids would think, how do we minimize the disruption? Well, the way we minimize the disruption is by having their time with their parents after the divorce stay as close as possible to what it was before the divorce. So after the divorce, we want them to be spending 70-30 time if 70-30 time was more or less what it looked like before the divorce, 50-50 time if it looked like 50-50 before the divorce. Usually it's more like 90-10. Well, then it should look kind of like 90-10% after the divorce, if you're really thinking about what's good for kids. And courts now are not only insisting on these trends more towards 50-50 time, but if they're not doing that right away, they're insisting that that has to be the goal. Like, we're going to still aim for 5 years from now to get it to 50-50, even if we're not doing that now. That's got nothing to do with what's good for kids. So the court system is extremely broken and has a huge pro-father bias. And the fathers who are out in the street claiming, oh, the courts have this huge pro-mother bias, which, as far as I can tell, never really existed, are overwhelmingly abusers. And from the beginning of the so-called fathers' rights movement, have been overwhelmingly abusers. How do I know this? From reading the literature that they hand me in the street back in their days when they were out in the street a lot. And nowadays they're primarily web focused and seeing what's on their websites. Their websites are almost entirely, also there's a difference between what they hand you on the street and what they say on their websites, because what they say on the websites are just what they want other fathers to hear. What they hand you on the street is what they want the public to know, right? And so it's very revealing what they say to other fathers. What their websites are focused on: grievances about child support, grievances about so-called false accusations of domestic violence, and grievances about so-called false accusations of child sexual abuse. In other words, their whole goal is to appeal to men who are resentful about child support and who've been accused of domestic violence or accused of child sexual abuse. Well, most of those are abusers, right? We know that there are some false accusations, but there aren't a lot of them. We know that accusations are overwhelmingly true. There's research showing that accusations are overwhelmingly true, even in the midst of divorce. Not all of them. The court does obviously still have to do proper analysis because there are some false allegations, proper investigation. But we know that they're overwhelmingly true. So if you're building an organization, in fact, not an organization, but a movement, by recruiting people who've been accused of abusing women or abusing children, particularly the sexual abuse of children, That's who you're accusing is batterers, and that's who you're recruiting is
Mm.
batterers and incest perpetrators.
Ah.
And but they've been taken so seriously in the court. They're considered the voice of fathers. I had a struggle once with a journalist about who I was being interviewed by about these issues, saying, well, we have to get a quote from the fathers' rights people before we run the story in order to have it balanced. And I say, that's not balanced. Those aren't the voice of fathers. Those are the voice of abusers. It's like if you're going to write an article about race, would you say, well, it wouldn't be balanced unless I get some quotations from the Ku Klux Klan?
Oh gosh, so right. Yeah, yeah. That's amazing. And I think the interesting thing about that is exactly what you said about, it in the guise of let's do what's best for the children. You've even talked about how men who have been convicted of serious abusive crimes, the courts are still like, but you know what? Kids need their dads. Kids need to be with their dads. And so even in the case, a conviction, they're like, but they need to be with their dads. Talk a little bit about that.
There was a stunning case. There was a stunning case that I read about in the newspaper, and then I may have found a reference to it in a law journal that I've lost track of. If anybody knows how to find this case, please. I hope they'll let you know, and that you can let me know. And there may be other cases of this kind for all I know, but there was a case where father had killed their mother, and he was in jail, convicted of having killed their mother, and the judge required the children to go to the prison to visit him, and who had murdered their mother and was convicted. It was in jail because he was convicted of having murdered their mother. And the judge wrote in her ruling, which I read, that the fact that he had killed their mother didn't automatically show that he was a bad father. Well, what could you do worse to children than murder their mother? Like what is the absolute definition of bad fatherhood? And at a lower level, this relates to what's going on in the custody courts all the time, which is you're constantly hearing evaluators, judges, lawyers, psychologists saying, well, the fact that he's abused their mother doesn't show that he's a bad father. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Abusing children's mother, statistically, if you look at the research, is one of the worst things you can do for your children. That's terrible fathering. It's one of the things most condemn them to a life of difficulty. You can also look at the adverse childhood experiences study for further evidence of that, but just dozens and dozens of studies showing that that's one of the worst things you can do for your kids. So how can they possibly? It's simply illogical to say, well, he's abused their mother, but he's still a good father, because by definition, he's not a good father if he's abused their mother. And if he's capable of doing something that's that destructive to his kids, what's the likelihood that that's the only destructive behavior he's showing towards them?
So true. And in what other situation? I mean, let's say it wasn't the mother that he killed, but it was the neighbor that he killed. Then would the justice system say, you know what? You guys that belong to that guy's family, I know he killed your father, but you were just a neighbor, but you should go and visit him in prison because he was still your neighbor. And we're all human. We all make mistakes. I'm so tired of hearing that. Nobody's perfect. I mean, what other community would that be like? Yes, you should go and visit this guy that drove drunk and killed your wife and your kids. You should go visit him.
It's a really good point. It's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that, but that's a really good point. I doubt children are ever required to go visit a parent who's guilty of a murder unless that person has murdered their mother.
Yeah.
That's just considered this special crime. It's, crime of passion, as they call it. It's a really good point. I'll say one more thing about that people might be. I'll say one more thing about that people might be interested in, which is that one of the excuses for a lot of these policies is a study that came out about maybe 20 years ago now, a long time ago now, finding that children who were being raised by single mothers were having a lot more difficulties than children who were being raised in two-parent families. And this study became just an excuse for years and years. It's probably still an excuse today for looking negatively on single mothers and
Mm.
insisting on keeping fathers involved at all costs. That study basically should be laughed out of any discussion because it did not control for class. Single mothers are much poorer, much more impoverished than two-parent families. So you're comparing apples to oranges. And what you were seeing was the destructive effect on kids of poverty. And so the proper response to that study would have been, we have to increase our safety net. We have to improve social welfare. However, that study came out at a time when social welfare was being cut, as it continues to be cut to this day. And so policymakers, rather than saying, oops, we need to stop these cuts and in fact go back in the other direction with respect to social welfare, what policymakers did instead is say, we've got to keep fathers involved. And of course, my 30 years in domestic violence, I'm constantly hearing from kids who now adults, but who were kids growing up in this kind of environment, how much better things were once dad was out of the house.
Yeah.
We're not talking about problems, we're talking about abusers.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because in
Sorry,
my experience, and this is the problem with everyone, unless you've experienced something, it's sometimes where it's hard to believe the story. But I mean, my parents got divorced when I was 7. My dad was kind of an absentee father when they were together. And so, he was never abusive, but he was just like, whatever, I'm not married to you anymore. And I've moved over here and I've got a new wife and I couldn't care less about the kids that I have. But there was never any, physical abuse or mental abuse. It was just complete neglect and I couldn't care less. But my mom immediately, I always reference this. I love the Mad Men series because it was set in the 60s, and that's my childhood. So I remember there was a scene where the husband said to his wife, "Oh, you were waiting until you got a lifeboat before you jumped ship." And I remember that was like, boop, because my mom had kind of already put her eyes on somebody and was remarried within 6 months. Fortunately, the man that she married, my stepfather, was a great guy. But so I never experienced any of the abuse. And now I live in Arizona. It's a 50-50 state. And so when I hear stories of women that say, well, I was divorced, but my husband claimed bankruptcy. He never had another job so that he wouldn't have to pay child support. And my first thought was, well, that can't be true. I mean, it's a 50-50 state. You should have gotten 50% of the business, or you should have gotten 50% of the assets, or how can that be? That just can't be true. But I'm hearing this story over and over again where the men claim bankruptcy. They don't work. They quit working, so they don't have an income. So now they don't have to pay alimony or child support. Blows my mind. And so when you say that it's not the divorce, it's the poverty, it's like, yes. But so talk again about the justice system that doesn't support the moms and the kids.
Well, and it ties back to what I was saying way back when I was using the analogy about a country where everybody drinks heavily. You don't
Yeah.
have to have something wrong with you to abuse alcohol.
Yeah.
The people are reluctant to look at how much support there is societally for domestic violence in the United States. And I say, look at what happens when an abuser gets prosecuted. Little happens when he gets prosecuted. Look at what kinds of consequences he faces if convicted of a domestic violence offense. So little. The consequences are so minor. Look at the child custody system and its complete refusal to take domestic violence or child sexual abuse in any way seriously. You cannot tell me that this is a society that condemns domestic violence. There are a lot of people in this society who condemn domestic violence, but overall social values, not nearly there yet. They love to condemn a high-profile abuser, but to actually condemn the behavior, to actually impose consequences, do anything about wealthier abusers, et cetera, zip. So we're still dealing with a society where huge societal changes need to happen for there to actually be a disapproval, a societal disapproval, refusal to accept male violence against women.
Yeah. And do you see in your group, was there any kind of a relativity around, like, I know there's this huge Christian nationalist movement right now where this patriarchy is kind of being applauded and encouraged once again. Was there ever like, I know I left a fundamental religion, and I remember it took me a while because I was young when I got married, but in my marriage vows, I was told that I was to be a helpmate and a servant unto my husband, that I was to be a support system for him. This came from God. And so, fortunately, my husband didn't take it, but I've talked with other women whose husbands literally took that as, this is my new role from God. I've been designated as the sole person in this family. You are to be subjected to me and my desires and my wills. And they took that literally. And so, did you see any kind of like, a lot of these men came from highly religious backgrounds, or
A fair number did. They point to their excuses, and so we learn, in a group they start to make their excuses. So we learn from what they're pointing to what some of their key influences were. And certainly I had quite a number of clients over the years who would say, like, the Bible says. And of course, I don't think I don't know if there's anywhere in the Bible that says a man has a right to beat his wife, but they're saying he is the head of the household, that she's to defer. And what we can say is, well, where does it tell you that if she doesn't do that, you get to terrorize her? And but yeah, certainly Christians will point to the Bible, and I think people point to their scriptures from other religions to justify what they're doing. But men who aren't religious just find a different set of things to point to. They'll say, oh, everybody knows that such and such, which just means I grew up surrounded by values that men have the right to do this kind of enforcing. And so much of domestic abuse is about enforcement. He not only believes what he believes, but he has the right to enforce those beliefs, to force them on the woman. But yes, I'm very concerned about the general trend in our times that you're referring to, back towards saying our scriptures say that you must submit. That's very, very frightening. And of course, the abuser also feels he writes an extra sentence for himself that says, and if you don't submit, I get to terrorize you.
That's so interesting. So as we close, talk about the system that you have set up, and that you are working with groups of people, not only in domestic abuse, but in other forms of abuse. What are some top ways of dealing with the justice system and the culture and the entitlement? What are maybe your key things that people can learn?
Well, when I came into the field in the late 1980s, which is going to date me a bit, there was a huge activist aspect to the work. It was a movement. We referred to it as the Battered Women's Movement. And there were protests, and there were sit-ins, and there was lots of anti-writing, and there were marches in the street and boycotts, and that energy has gone out of the movement. The domestic violence work has become very professionalized, very polite, and that's a mistake. And that's part of why we've started to lose gains that we made, is that's what happens to any movement. Once it gets polite and sort of working from the inside, as they say, the system starts to take back the concessions that it made and starts to want to go back to its old ways. The civil rights movement went through the same thing, where once the real hell-raising period of the civil rights movement passed, and people were given jobs in government and given government programs and given money and told, now you'll be able to solve these problems, they discovered they couldn't solve the problems because the government was actually pulling back. And now, as you know, African Americans and other people of color in the U.S. face as difficult circumstances as they did 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And so that's my number one message, is this has to go back to being an activist, cage rattling, in your face kind of movement. We have to stop being so polite, and the focus has to be on women. And I feel bad for men who are being mistreated in their relationships. I don't think it's okay. I'm not minimizing it, but it doesn't work when you try to build a movement that's trying to address too many different things at once. It all ends up being like watered down tea. And if you're going to fight male violence against women successfully, that has to be your focus. Say, yeah, we care about that other stuff, and we care about cancer, and we care about war, we care about a lot of stuff. But the only way we're going to be effective in overcoming male violence against women is by focusing on male violence against women. And that means I really wish domestic violence programs would go back to just serving female victims and have separate programs for male victims, not be mixing them together. It's not working well at all, mixing them together. For reasons I don't even have time to go into today. So that's one of my key messages. And then the second message is that there's still so much blaming of women today. It takes different forms. People are less likely now to say she provoked him and are more likely to say things like, well, she was addicted to him, or she was codependent, or just find other ways, to blame her for having been there. And that does not help her get out. The only thing that helps her get out, and it takes years to get out, is people who don't blame her in any way, don't start saying, oh, you must have been attracted to abuse. There's no evidence that women are attracted to abusers. And they're just on her side and say, this, how you're being treated is wrong. How can I help? And it's going to take her some time to even look at it. And instead of criticizing her for that, understand if you were in that position, it would take you quite a while to look at it. Right. These are just human beings in oppressive circumstances, and this is what oppression does to people. And just really focus on being there for her and believing in her, and stop trying to always find something she needs to look at about herself. No, she needs gradually to face what he's doing and find ways to try to get her rights back. And she's going to do that as well as she can. And the more support she gets, the faster she's likely to be able to get through that. It's trauma.
Yeah, I love that. That's what a great way to end, Lundy. I appreciate your time so much, and I love the message, especially because I hear that's generational. Where if the abuser happens to be financially successful or has great success in his business hierarchy, he holds positions of power, then I think that even kind of accelerates the blame that women get. That they didn't appreciate what was being done for them, or she took advantage of his money, or didn't support him because he was, look how hard worker he was, and all of that kind of stuff. And so you're right. It's we still have to go back to believing the women and supporting the women. And then really, I love what you said, especially about looking at the relationship that the children have with their mother. And you can't take a 90-10 relationship and turn it into a 50-50. I love that reference as well. So many great points. So you're no longer doing domestic violence therapy groups. What are you doing now?
And it was never therapy, but it was never therapy. We call it batterer intervention counseling or abuser intervention counseling. But no, I still do trainings, domestic abuse trainings for professionals, but I don't do any direct service kind of work anymore. And I'm primarily a writer now and an activist and working on other things. So that's great to talk to you. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's been my absolute pleasure. And I'm going to put up the picture of your books as well, and remind women to be there for each other, support one another, and to listen to your sisters. That's my message. So thank you so much for joining me today. Once again, I say this after every single podcast that I do. I don't know how I find these people, but it is so enlightening. And when I listen to Lundy and talk about the support that he has for women, just absolutely blew my mind. And I loved the knowledge that he had behind the control of abuse, and how is that person out of control, or is this just a behavior that's been taught? And I think sometimes I know for those of us that came from very fundamental patriarchal systems, even in the religion that I left, boys at the age of 11 are literally told that they have power from God. And then, as I mentioned, there are so many set up indoctrination programs teaching men that they are the presiders of their home, and they give them their roles that they are to be the financial protectors and and provide for the providers for their families. And it does give them that responsibility, but it also puts responsibility on the women to be the caregivers for the entire family, to everyone in the family except themselves. So anyway, I loved Mr. Bancroft's message. So please go out and buy his books. Let me go back and show you the 5 books that he has. There we go. Why does he do that? The Batterer as Parent, The Joyous Recovery, Should I Stay or Should I Go? When Dad Hurts Mom, Daily Wisdom for Why Does He Do That? So those are his 5 books. You can get those on Amazon. And I know I'm going to be looking into this one specifically. As I mentioned, it's so important right now with everything that's going on politically. I really want to encourage, especially for the women, to be there for each other, because women are going to need more support than ever before. And I liked what Lundy said was, whenever there's activism and there's movement, once there's been an accomplishment in that movement, there's a tendency for everything to kind of go back down, thinking that you fixed it. And then once it's been supposedly fixed, then everything kind of goes back to the way it was. And so there needs to be a consistent movement amongst each other. And as I mentioned, the saddest thing for me is to consistently, just a couple weeks ago on my podcast, you guys, I had the exact same story. She wasn't being physically abused, but her husband was cheating on her. And the first thing he did was claim bankruptcy, left her and her 2 children penniless. I hear that story all the time. So it is definitely something that we have to be at least aware of, and also be there for each other. So thank you for joining me today on She Became Visible. And hopefully we will get this all edited and all my craziness in the beginning will be taken care of. So thanks for joining me. We'll see you again next week on She Became Visible. And don't forget, you got to subscribe, you got to like, and you've got to share. That's all. I don't want your money. I just want your support. Thanks again. Bye-bye.